All right, so we're recording. I'm here with Kaiser. How are you doing today, Kaiser?
A little bit heated. That's about it. Everything else is chill, except
So
for the temperature.
I reached out to you. I when people subscribe to me or interact with me on Substack, they like an article. I try to check out other people's Substacks and just see what's out there. Try to kind of give everybody a chance. I think I
Hmm.
first messaged you like the night of September 7th. I saw that you had stuff about colonialism and eugenics, and you weren't really coming at it from like a conservative perspective. You had some stuff on metaphysics, and I thought, okay, this is controversial. This guy seems intelligent. He doesn't seem like dog. Not that I have. I can't speak to a conservative, but I typically find that it's more difficult to gain anything or to learn anything because you've got someone who's just kind of stating axioms. Go read the Bible. Okay, uh, there's not much for me to get out of that. So, that's why I reached out to you. And
So
the
did you say that you were a follower or a subscriber, or
No,
have
I,
you
I,
looked through
I
both?
think you interacted with me in some way. You liked or you subscribed or
Um,
whatever came
well, if
first.
you hate axioms, do not look in my notes section. I can promise you, you will not be happy there,
Don't be. Why won't I be happy?
because it is so many aphorisms and axioms and so forth. Pretty much the whole thing.
Okay. Um,
But then again, if you want to put together a book, I'm open source. You could get a couple of books out of that. Go for it.
okay.
But it's gonna be axioms.
Yeah.
So, but you want to talk more about the notes then, or the posts, I should say, the posts.
Yeah. I guess I don't really use the app on my phone, so I maybe with the phone display, I can obviously find your notes, but it wasn't right in front of me. I saw
Yeah,
the
you have to. They just added a notes tab to the author's page tabs. I
yeah.
guess is how it's called.
Yeah, I'm looking at that now. So I basically I messaged you. I said, hey, let's do something, and you were open to that, so we started talking, and so I went back to check in on your Substack, and I realized that the within like 12 hours of me reaching out to you, you wrote an article that says some thoughts about pedophilia. There goes my subscriber count.
Actually, it only went down by 3. I was surprised.
Yeah, yeah. And so then I realized, and then I said I should probably I should probably take a look more closely here. And I noticed that you had written prior articles addressing similar topics about the age of consent, and that topic is not one that I have ever felt the need to actively. I mean, I would say similar to race and IQ, that I am not interested in deconstructing or scrutinizing um, or attacking, that. But when people do bring it up, and I have noticed an overlap, maybe it's a small overlap, but I've noticed people like Nick Fuentes who are have this personality of saying, well, I'll pursue the truth wherever it leads me, and I'm willing to kind of, say whatever, and I don't have any masters, so I can say controversial things. And he said things about why he thinks teenagers should get married, and obviously coming from a Catholic perspective rather than maybe where you're coming from, which may be a more Satanist friendly perspective. But maybe tell me, you also have articles on Satanism, and I think you say Satanism has one of the best constitutions or set of principles out of various.
Well, that's one very specific sliver of Satanism, which is the tenets of the Satanic Temple. as opposed to those of the Satanic Church under Antoine LaVey. That's all the woo and arcane sort of things. And so personally, I dispense with any of that kind of thing. But if you look at those tenets, they're as solid a foundation for ethics as you can find anywhere. It's certainly better than most religions. Certainly better than the Ten Commandments, for that matter. Completely rational and completely humanist, completely, how shall we say, friendly, altruistic even. Although maybe more on the libertarian side of that. But I digress. You were saying?
Yeah, so obviously I'm not equating you. I bring up that example not to equate you with Nick Fuentes, but just to say that there obviously was a period, there's a history of the legalization of pornography that people are not aware of, where there was no there was no concept that we have in this modern day of a restriction, an age-based restriction on pornography that didn't exist in many countries for much of the 1960s or later 1960s, 1970s. And it wasn't until in America the moral majority, the Reagan coalition, got together to put an end to that. And following that, there were court cases regarding to entrapment schemes because that material had been legal not to produce, but to distribute. And so you could have companies that would be based in the Netherlands or Scandinavia. They would produce this material. They would then ship it and distribute it to the United States in the form of magazines. People would buy that. And that was a fully legal process in America for, I don't know what it was, like 10 to 15 years. I might be slightly wrong on the exact number. But so that was a period of American history that we've sort of forgotten. Allen Ginsberg was a member of NAMBLA. He supported that. Obviously, we're more aware in Europe. The French left, Foucault, signed these.
Woody Allen.
Yeah. We've even had. You could talk about. I'm forgetting the Polish American director who was. I suppose he was never convicted, but
was that Roman Polanski?
Yes, Roman Polanski. Okay. So this story, I mean, it's a very uncomfortable topic. It's not really what I wanted to go into, or something I actively do on my Substack. But I'm maybe pathologically committed to talking to people, and this is the topic that is the first one of your most recent articles. So I figure on the, I think most people would say to ignore this, and my instinct is kind of to be confrontational and to be like, well, if you believe in rationalism, and I think that we can try to rationally understand something, whether we agree or disagree, then we can have a conversation about it. So I want to take a look at. And of course, we have time to speak about other things as well. So I don't. If you don't want to have this dominate the conversation, we can move on at your leisure. But you mentioned.
I'm not sure I'll have much to add. I think I've made all the points that would be relevant to sort of detangling any specific example of anything to do with children and sexual activity. I think there's an answer in there somewhere for just about anything.
Okay, I want to address point F that you make in this article. Okay. You say there's nothing inherently harmful about sex, and the risks can be mediated without censure or shame for anyone. Is that just an axiomatic belief that you have? How do you justify the belief that sex is not inherently harmful?
Well, you can. So the risks have to do with physical harm, like injury, physical injury, or emotional injury, or future consequences. And each of those can be understood. They're relatively simplistic. They can be avoided by using birth control or, waiting for the appropriate length of time, whatever that may be. I'm not going to say what that is, but it's certainly not whatever society has said. And so, in any case, for millions and millions of years, it wasn't this big harmful monster that everybody's trying to treat it as today. And it really doesn't need to be. In fact, I personally believe that the way society treats these things is vastly more harmful than the activity that typically takes place in that realm.
Okay, so you listed, I guess, three things that you said could be harmful. You said there could be physical risks, and I'm just going to ignore that component for a moment. And then you said there could be emotional risks, and you said there could be further consequences. And I suppose what you mean when you say further consequences is you're saying pregnancy or
Right.
societal.
Well,
Sorry,
yeah, well,
I don't know if there's a delay or not, but
pregnancy,
we're talking over each other.
yeah, pregnancy per se, or actually having a child. Two different varieties of harms could come from that, or blessings. Either way.
So the question was, you say that the emotional risks of sexuality are simple and can be easily avoided. So if they are simple, can you explain to me what those simple emotional risks are?
Well, so the risks are all simplistic. That is to say, they can be easily broken down into a taxonomy of distinctiveness. That's only maybe 10 different kinds of things. That's all I mean by that. So on an individual level, of course, it's completely complicated because everybody has to know their own mind and their own, emotions and their own priorities, and that's something that never happens. But that's a side point. What was the question again?
Okay, so you say there's a taxonomy of 10 different types of emotional harm that can be caused by
Well,
sexuality.
no, not an emotional harm per se, just different varieties. Like I just broke it down into three. Those could be broken down into several more. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, what
Simplistic in
are
that manner.
what are the three types of emotional harm that proceed from sexuality?
No, the three. I just made that number up. There are three different varieties. So um, the physical injury risk, the emotional injury risk, and future consequences that don't have anything to do with those other two. As far as emotional harm, I haven't actually broken it down yet. Um, undue attachment, um, feeling of betrayal, feeling that society was not backing them up. That would be three off the top of my head. I haven't done the taxonomy on that.
When you say emotional attachment, betrayal, society not backing them up, are you speaking about the adult or are you speaking about the child?
The assuming there's a victim, that would be the varieties of victimization, roughly speaking, in the emotional sense.
Okay. So, um, do you believe that it is appropriate to, you know, prohibit activity or to make things illegal on the basis of heuristics? So what I mean by that is to say, um, let's say we passed a law saying that people under the age of 18 are not allowed to purchase a firearm because we believe that under the age of 18 they're not responsible enough to use it. That's not saying epistemically we know 100% that there are no 17-year-olds who could responsibly use a firearm. Of course they are. That's just an arbitrary number. Or to give you a second example, we say that generally under the age of 16, and in some states 15 and a half or 14 if you work on a farm, we say that but there's an age at which we don't trust people to learn to drive. Now, again, epistemically, can we say with 100% certainty that there isn't a really tall, mature 13-year-old who couldn't handle the responsibility of driving? No, we can't say that with certainty, but we use these heuristics to say, we're going to tolerate this level of risk, and above this age, the risk tolerance is acceptable. Below this age, it's not acceptable. Do you believe that is an appropriate way to legislate?
I do not. I believe that all legal fictions are inherently counterproductive to any variety of justice or fairness. So that includes age limits. If they really are as important, I think I put that on, somewhere further down that list. If such things really are so important, then they need to be treated with kid gloves, not with a blunt force instrument. That's really quite ridiculous. And I believe that in actuality, it plays out quite often, if not nearly always, that the harm is greater from the attempt to prevent these things than it is from accepting them as they are and rolling them into society.
Okay.
So, for instance, if there is actual harm being done, then that's already covered on other laws. To add a sexual component doesn't do anything but make things more complicated. It obfuscates the situation, makes it even more impossible to deal with. Same thing could be said for, um, well, nothing else comes off the top of my head.
Okay. So my question was, do you think it's ever appropriate to assign a year, to legislate using a year of life and say, above this year we
No, no,
find the
no,
risk acceptable, below this year we find the risk unacceptable? So,
absolutely not. No, no. Every legal fiction, without exception, is anti-justice. Justice can only be individual and specific. That individual person was or was not harmed, was or was not ready to consent, did or did not step beyond the bounds of propriety, whatever the case may be. To assume anything in justice is to forego justice entirely. Plea bargains was the other thing I was trying to think of. Something like that, it just cannot be just. Age limits cannot be just because only in the very tiny sliver in the middle of the bell curve will actually be appropriate for. Everyone else, it's wrong. The vast majority, it's wrong.
okay, so I'll do you believe, I mean, what mechanism would you use to read people's minds to figure out whether or not they, a form of intercourse was just? Because I'm assuming what you're saying is that there's a bell curve and therefore there are some 19-year-olds who cannot consent to sex. So how are we going to read
Yeah,
the minds of those 19-year-olds and figure out whether or not
yeah.
they were mentally capable of consenting?
Well, there's some 99-year-olds who were never ready for it either. Not that that stopped them. Um, so I believe it can only be done by psychological analysis. Someone who understands that they understand the risks and what the best decision is and why. And it's not really rocket science. You just have to, find a way to get truthful answers to questions that actually demonstrate understanding. And then you can know they're ready, or at least as ready as is certainly more ready than a default age test.
What I would say is that I would agree that there are certain circumstances if somebody is extremely mentally impaired, you could say they don't have the ability to, if, for instance, if somebody is nonverbal, if someone is mentally disabled in an obvious, commonsensical way, then you could say, okay, yeah, this person can't consent. Most children are not mentally disabled, and therefore, if you say that there's some kind of psychometric test that needs to be assessed to people, I'm skeptical. I can't conceive of how you would implement that measure of
Well, we
justice
do.
because we're talking about, you know, you're basically saying, it's like we're going to have to pass the bill before we can read it. You're saying, well, first, a potential criminal act has to occur. Then, after the criminal act has occurred, we're going to assess whether or not it was a criminal act. That's not how most law works. Most law has a
No, no, no.
preventative function.
That's an extremely anarchic way to approach it, and but it need not be that. You can simply have a license for readiness for sex, for cars, for guns, for alcohol, for LSD. It's not that hard to just test people, and see if they're ready, see if they understand. And if they do understand and they're willing to take on the responsibility, then that's just called being a free and responsible citizen. You don't need anything else. Society has a right to ensure such dangers are avoided in the first place, of course. But that doesn't mean you have the right to ban anyone from that activity under the assumption that they're not ready. It's a fundamental human rights issue that you cannot merely control someone because you think it's for the best. And that's a whole nother, we get on a whole nother track there. But the bottom line is justice, and for that matter, safety, can only be ensured by actually testing people to see if they're actually ready to handle the problems that might come of it,
Do you believe
or
that
vice versa. Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that parents have some form of partial ownership over their children to the point where they're able to coerce them?
So ownership and consent have both come up now, and that's two whole topics of their own. But let me set ownership aside very quickly. Ownership is of three kinds. There's ethical, there's legal, and there's actual. So parents have actual ownership over their children to the extent they, or basically to the extent they have, uh, to the extent that children need them, and to the extent the state backs that up, they have legal ownership. And to the extent they're trying to do the right thing for the child, then they have ethical ownership. Now, consent doesn't have to be actual. It has never had to be actual. If that was necessary, we wouldn't have caretakers. It just wouldn't be a possible thing. Um, so parents always have control over and varieties of ownership over their children under the assumption that they know better than those children how to behave in the world. So that caretaking exemption can be managed for any kind of consent. If someone is just low IQ, they're going to have a caretaker to determine their consent for them, as long as children are below whatever their parents make the decision for them. Um, I had another example in mind. What do you think here? Well, anyway, any sort of stewardship is an assumption that someone can make consensual decisions on behalf of another person. And the only correct way to do that is to know what the actual issues are and whether they're actually instigated, that's not the word I'm looking for, whether they're actually part of the given issue and how to test for them. These are all issues that can be very simply, not easily, simply managed. Um, what do we know about consent? So consent does not have to be willful. When somebody pushes you out of the way of the bus, they don't get in trouble for that because they didn't stop and get your consent. There's lots of different varieties of ways. When you have a pet, it's assumed that you're going to do the right thing for them. So as long as the person in charge of the decision is capable of and actively attempting to make good decisions for the other person, the details are really irrelevant. If the person has the right to make those decisions on their own, then that can be tested and licensed. And if they don't, then they can be given a caretaker. Either way, the state doesn't need to be involved, and there's no ethical issue that can't be dealt with.
So you said that basically parents have effective ownership of their children to the extent that they make decisions for them. Um, but you don't believe that the state has effective ownership of citizens?
The state has effective ownership of everyone. It certainly doesn't have ethical ownership of anyone. Even those who consent don't really know what they're consenting to, as far as the social contract goes. But that's a separate issue again.
No, I think it's a very close. I mean, if you're trying to make a moral argument here, I think these are very related issues. So you don't think that the state has any ethical claim to any sort of ownership of the citizenry at all?
Absolutely not. No. If you want to look into a whole list of details, there's a book called No Constitution, or let me see, No Treason, The Constitution of No Authority by Lysander Spooner. It was written a couple hundred years ago. And I think you'll find that everything in it is just as applicable today and just as applicable in any other country. What it boils down to is very simple logical precepts, like a person can't make a contract for someone else. You can't be bound to a contract that was made before you were even born, or that you were never aware of when you were supposed to have signed it, or that cannot be explicitly examined, just everything. So there's no state, as a matter of fact, on the face of the earth, as far as I know, has ever been legitimate, has ever been actually for the good of all the citizens, or for that matter, all the creatures within their jurisdiction. So no state is legitimate. No state has the legitimacy to tell other people how to live, and the ways of actually mitigating these kinds of harms that deal with consent or ownership for that matter are not the ways the state deals with them. They put fictions, which are essentially lies, in place of actually understanding the just thing to do. It's very hard. It's hard to test people and find out if they're ready for this and that, but it can be done. We've done it before. We do it in all kinds of ways. And the fact that it's hard doesn't excuse anybody from finding out if they're doing the right thing before they insist on affecting someone else's life. So if someone is ready for anything at any age, at that point, no one could possibly have the right to stop them from doing that. That's a direct infringement of their basic autonomy. The same as stopping somebody from committing suicide. You're putting your own desires above their deepest needs, as far as you know. So, yeah, that's a can of worms. Where do you want to go?
No, I mean, I'm glad we've come to this point because it helps. I think it's much easier because I think honestly the age of consent is a very specific and particular downstream. At least if we're taking the position that these are rational moral arguments, and we're just going from base principles and going from the ground up. It's actually more pertinent, and because it's the general case. The general case is the state ever legitimate? And you're saying no, the state is never legitimate. But then you're also
However, one of the articles, let me make sure I get this right. Posts. One of the posts that you referenced to me was the mandate for libertarian socialist fascism, or sorry, libertarian fascist socialism, and that's directly applicable here, because I believe that based on 4 fundamental ethical universals, there's only one direction government ought to go to be legitimate, and it requires those 3 elements in a particular combination.
okay.
Do you happen to have that article pulled up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm I'm kind of just trying to take the one by one here.
Okay.
You have this concept that in order to determine if somebody is ready for something, whether that is intercourse, whether that is gun ownership, whether that is driving a car, whether that is signing a contract, you believe that we should we should test their ability with a test. We should give them a test, and then if they
Yes.
pass the test, we should give them a license. So my question to you, and I guess your answer would be it would be the libertarian socialist fascist. but, but like I don't know what practical real world institution um, could institute like who decides what are the questions, how long are the questions, what are the correct answers, what are the wrong answers, is it multiple choice, is it open-ended, is it an oral examination, is it a written examination, can you do it online, do you have to do it in person, who
Well,
decides all this?
first the state has to establish legitimacy, and then through that legitimacy, it can make its own best decision and use best practices until such time as they find a better way. So the cornerstone, if you look up, there's an image. It's called the Pillars of Procedural Justice. There's 4 of them. I don't know if you want to look that up or not, but fairness, transparency, voice. I can't remember exactly what they are. But those are basically the pillars of legitimacy. If the state actively seeks out knowing what's best for the people, allows them to meaningfully be heard, actually addresses their complaints, is itself transparent and accountable in order to avoid corruption and seizure. If those things are established, then the state is legitimate, and in that legitimacy, it will make legitimate decisions about whether or not it has the right to infringe on other people's activities, and only do so when there's, actual harm or actual danger. But even there, the state must forbear, because as the de facto monopoly on the use of power, it has the greatest responsibility to avoid using that power, as much as possible. It should always use softest, least intrusive means to do everything. So even if the state has a right to interfere, it doesn't necessarily have the right to prevent or to ban or to censor. Those things are way downstream. It has the necessity to prevent harm. It does not have the right to interfere in order to prevent harm. That must be earned. And it must be shown rationally and logically in a way that ordinary citizens can understand. And all those elements of legitimacy are completely missing, especially from the US government, but as far as I know of every government that's ever existed, because their jurisdictional boundary in the first place was completely arbitrary. No legitimate national state boundary has ever existed. On top of which, no government has ever listened to all the citizens. No government has ever addressed all citizens' needs or attempted to. So, right, so legitimacy. When the state does establish legitimacy, then it has everything needed to make those decisions on behalf of the people within its jurisdiction. And the cornerstone of that legitimacy is actually caring for every individual, never special interests, not even the majority. If you have a democracy, you have an illegitimate state because there's always going to be somebody left behind. And if you leave somebody behind, you can't be a legitimate state. You can only be a slave state. You're oppressing at least someone, and that can't be legitimate.
Okay. I endorse slavery. I guess that's my solution out of your moral quandary. Is I think, I guess when I listen, I'm trying to listen to what you're saying here, and I'm trying to attach it to something that I can understand. And Stefan Molyneux, who I think is now banned off YouTube, he used to have this video. I think it had millions of, it was the video that he kind of posted as his like introductory video everyone would see if you went to his YouTube channel, and it was called The Story of Your Enslavement. And he was saying some of the things that maybe you can elucidate some differences, but he was saying every state that's ever existed has been a slave state. And when I was a libertarian, I was sympathetic to that line of reasoning that the state is a monopoly on violence, which is bad. The state is coercive, which is bad. Taxation is theft, which is bad. And then you made this point, which you said the state should rationally justify itself in a way that is understandable to ordinary citizens, but not in a democratic way, but in an absolute way. That if even one man is left behind, then the state is illegitimate. And I just accept. I mean, if you're going to call that slavery, then I endorse slavery. I think slavery is a good thing, and I think that people should be enslaved because the ordinary citizen is not capable of understanding a rational justification for any law. The ordinary citizen is capable of peasantry and farming and working and maybe contributing to the economy. The ordinary citizen is not capable of rational thought such that they're philosophically going to
That's
understand a justification for any law. So I think you're
that's very
projecting
very
something onto
federalist
the
of you.
ordinary person that's inappropriate.
To say that's very federalist of you. Now, that's not to say that the ordinary person gets to account for themselves. I don't agree with democracy at all. I believe, as you do, that the ordinary person has neither the means nor the motive nor the intent to understand government, politics, economics, and anything else that's necessary to be involved. However, they do have to have their needs accounted for to get that legitimacy. So you can call someone a slave if they're not able to affect the government. But if they get everything they need and have equality of opportunity toward what they want, it's a meaningless distinction. Direct interaction with and control over the government is not necessary. The government can know, as you say, better than the people what's right for them. And I can assure that. But it has to do that on an individual level. If it does that on a group level, it's just a tyranny with a different number of victims.
Okay, so in addition to slavery, I also endorse tyranny because I just don't. I don't. I think you're axiomatically putting forth a moral paradigm where if any, and I think I use these terms endearingly, so it's not meant as a pejorative or a slur. But if any freak or weirdo somewhere out there at any time doesn't feel like the government has sufficiently rationally justified some law, I don't care. I don't care. I don't think that the state is obligated to present itself in that way. Um,
Well, why couldn't the state simply have a flow chart to say, here's why we make the decision we do, um, here's how it affects you, and here's why only irrational people would disagree. And these are not hard cases to make. So if somebody disagrees with something that is fundamentally rational, can be easily shown to be rational, then they're a mental health case. They're not a citizen.
no, what I'm saying is that I don't even think the state has an obligation to morally justify itself in the way that you're proposing.
Well, yeah, only if it wants to be legitimate. No, if the state wants to be legitimate, it has to account for every individual, not just sentient creature, or not just cognizant creature, but every sentient creature in its jurisdiction. It has to prevent harm, as above all. If it harms, then it's not. Then it can't be legitimate because it's not working for the best good of everyone.
okay.
If it incidentally causes harm, that's a separate issue. That's a matter of complexity. But that too can be dealt with by bringing things down in scale, by diversifying power in other ways. So I agree with your points, but not your outcomes. I think there are straightforward, rational ways to overcome these issues and maintain the good of every individual and ensure that they're heard when they are being rational and prove to them that the decisions you make on their behalf are something they ought to accept, and make a clear division between when people have a stupid problem and a reasonable problem that needs to be addressed. All these things are straightforward. So we don't need tyranny. We need fascism because we have to have world level control for world level issues. But we don't have to do that with tyranny. We don't have to do that with authoritarianism. We can use least harmful means.
Okay. Yeah. I just rather than put the burden of proof on you to justify, whatever the details you like. If you were to come up with a policy paper and say this is the test that I think we should implement for driving, sexual consent, gun ownership, the ability to sign contracts. Here are the tests. I've come up with the tests, and we need a government which implements these tests. Whether or not that's possible, I'm not going to place the burden of proof on you right now.
There's a positive and a negative side to that. That is additive and subtractive. So on the additive side, we can say just about anything, even the tiniest bit more logically rational than what we have now, is something we should implement because it can't be worse. So we can move forward without having any of those details worked out. And on the negative side, as long as every law is necessary rather than speculative or based on assumptions, as long as it has a review date, and as long as it can be challenged, meaningfully challenged on any of its particulars, it can't go wrong. It can only get better over time in a Bayesian fashion. Are you familiar with Bayesian reasoning?
Look, what my point is that whether or not I agree with your saying or I think it's plausible, or I'm just going to try to be as charitable as possible to you, and I'm going to say I'm going to within this debate we're going to assume that it's possible to develop these tests, to implement them, to have a state where you're describing this kind of evolution and all of the law. Like, there's no assumptions in any law. It's purely rational laws. It's all scientific. I'm not going to debate, like, we don't have enough time, and I'm not actually inclined, or I don't think that's a worthwhile debate for us to have. I think you firmly believe in that. I probably am skeptical of that. But rather, I'm trying to make a moral point. I'm not trying to make a practical point and say that your libertarian socialist fascism is untenable or unlikely or implausible or impossible to implement. I'm just going to let you win on that one. What I'm trying to contend, or what I'm trying to push back on, is the idea that a state has a moral obligation to pursue your particular definition of legitimacy. I don't think your definition of legitimacy is itself legitimate. I think it's made up. And I don't see why I should adopt it. My definition of state legitimacy is a state is legitimate if it exists, essentially. And if you live, like, I live in America. So from my perspective, the state of North Korea is not legitimate because it contradicts the legitimacy of America. Whereas if you live in North Korea, they believe the American government is not legitimate. So in terms of, what makes a state legitimate or not, then you're asking, for my question, it's what state in particular do you support? Because different states have different theories of legitimacy. If I were to justify why I think the American state, why I'm not like on the dissident right or an anarchist who wants to disestablish the American government, is because I look out comparatively at all the other governments in the world and I say, okay, the American government is much better. And so, and I support it. And I think this is a practical way, to do good things, rather than make the perfect the enemy of the good and say, like, well, we're not libertarian, socialist, fascist enough, and therefore, I'm going to get into this purely theoretical space, and I'm going to because to me, calling the American state illegitimate, and you referenced the word treason, but it is an act of treason, and I think there's a moral case that advocating for the disestablishment of America, calling America illegitimate, saying we should have this theoretical system of justification that's based on rationality. I don't think the state has an obligation to the citizens to rationally justify itself. I think the state has an obligation to work and to function, to provide for defense, to provide a level of stability, to provide law, whatever that law is. Obviously, there are some laws I think are better than others. We could get into policy positions, but that would kind of be my final statement as we're wrapping up here. I want to give you the last word to, finish up whatever sort of arguments you want to make. Tell me, things that you recommend, people go and read, and promote whatever you want to promote.
Sure, sure. So the biggest difference between a potentially legitimate state and one that is not is whether it's merely might makes right with extra steps. That's a state of nature, and if humanity does not consider legitimacy to be beyond the state of nature, then it's nothing at all. It must be to use rationality rather than power and pragmatism. That's the only way we can move forward. And the fact that since the Enlightenment, those values have pretty much been captured or squandered is exactly why we're in the state we are in, because the values that supersede we're in charge, therefore we're going to do what we will, are the very ones that enable legitimacy in the first place. You can't have it with things as they are. And the only way, you mentioned something about what system might have the ability to implement this stuff. Well, there is none, because you can't fix a broken system with its own broken tools, and everything in the entire planet is already captured. Therefore, the only real option is a grassroots, open source, available to everyone movement to institute best practices, a parallel society that over time subverts current systems. There's no way to do it with what we've already got. So if we want any kind of legitimacy, any kind of government that can not leave anyone behind, then we must go past how things are and have always been and historical precedent, and move to a new paradigm of no one left behind. Everyone must have. If we don't go there, we might as well be lions and chimps. Whoever can does as they will. And no matter the number of systems and how complex they are and how many iterations they've been through, they're not really different.
Okay, that
As
sounds
far as
like
what to
you're.
read, well, I mentioned one book. Another I recommend for a broader audience would be Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World. That's a way to disabuse yourself of a lot of wound. And my notes and my posts on Substack, of course, you're gonna find a lot of interesting stuff in there, whether you agree or not. That's for sure.
Okay, well, I appreciate you coming on, Kaiser. Um, I hope people enjoy or get something out of this. That's all the time we have for now. So thanks for coming on, and I guess have a great rest of your day.
Will do. Will
All
do.
right, take care. Bye bye. Okay, you know I I told him I said he like people like an article or they restack something or they subscribe, and when they do that I say, okay, well, are they a Substack writer? And he had written some articles on colonialism, eugenics, metaphysics, topics that are controversial, um, topics that I was like, okay, well, he's clear, he's a Satanist, he's not a conservative. He calls himself a libertarian, fascist, socialist. So I was like, and some people, other writers I've seen that are bigger than him followed his account. So I said, okay, maybe he has something worthwhile to say. And so I reached out to him and said, I'm inviting you to have a discussion. I'm inviting you to have an interview. And the very next day, his the top of his article is, you know, I don't. I'm trying not to straw man because I guess that's a tendency that I have is to straw man people. But the title of the article is some thoughts about pedophilia, which is a pretty I mean, you guys can read the article and if you can if I really don't I don't think that I'm going to be having a huge number of debates like this in the future. Um, I think that a lot of people would watch this and say, this is not something that we can or should be rationally debating. And that's a fair position, in my opinion, given my embrace of tyrannical slavery. But I think it's important. I think it's important that um, I think it's important that we dispel the idea that there's this group of dissident thinkers who just they're not given the time of day, and if you give them the time of day, then like, well, and I reference Nick Fuentes as somebody who would say like, oh well, they'll never debate me on race realism because they're scared and they know they would lose. And also, Andrew Anglin of the Daily Storm will say, is the largest white nationalist website in the world. He'll say, we should abolish the age of consent, and the liberals are just, they're afraid and they have to ban discussion of this because they can't handle the truth. And so I guess that was maybe I failed. I failed today. But yeah, this is why I'm not a libertarian. I mean, this isn't the reason. Like when I deconverted from libertarianism, this wasn't the single issue in terms of the age of consent that said, you know what, I can't hang out with these people anymore. They're too weird, or this is evil or something like that. I actually deconverted for these fundamental reasons about state legitimacy, and yeah, libertarianism is putting forth a moral axiom that I don't buy into. You can say, yeah, the state has to legitimize itself in X, Y, Z, and I say no. We live in the real world. Various states exist. Some of them are better than others, and the one that is the best, in my opinion, is America, and therefore America is legitimate. If America at some point becomes worse than China or Russia or some other major state, then I would say, okay, it's not legitimate anymore. We should have a revolution. Obviously, if there was like a Catholic, if the Supreme Court declared that America is now a Catholic theocracy and Joe Biden is the emissary of the Pope, or I guess JD Vance, and let's say Trump dies in 2025, JD Vance is president, he declares a Catholic theocracy, the Supreme Court backs him up, they abolish the Congress, things are controlled directly from the Vatican, then I would say the state is illegitimate, we should have a revolution. But I don't, otherwise, yeah, I just can't. I don't take it that seriously. But I don't know. Hope somebody got something out. At the worst thing, I've wasted 50 minutes of your time, and I apologize. And hopefully, we'll have better content in the future. But I don't know, guys. Maybe that was entertaining. Hopefully, I try to be polite to people. I try to be kind and give people the time of day. Honestly, if he had written that if he had published that article before I reached out to him, I might have not reached out to him. But I try to be a man of my word, and if I offer an invitation to somebody, I feel like I'm being dishonest or cowardly. If I say, well, you have abhorrent views I disagree with, and they're really bad, and so I'm afraid to talk to you, I'm like, no, I I have to talk with everyone. So maybe that's a fatal flaw. Maybe that's going to be my downfall. We'll see. We'll see if I survive this one, guys. Anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye.